Welcome to the first virtual guest writers series of the academic year. My name is Jackie Balderrama. I'm a graduate student at the U and the administrative assistant helping to coordinate this series with creative writing administrator Alan Borst. Today, we are thrilled to welcome internationally best-selling author of 22 books and the recipient of Guggenheim and NEA fellowships, David Shields, who will engage in a conversation with our own professor of creative writing and Utah Poet Laureate, Paisley Rekdal. Please know this event is being recorded and will be made available to the U's Guest Writers Series main page for those who cannot attend at this time. In this virtual format, to allow more time for the main event, we are posting introduction videos for our guest writers on their main page and the Creative Writing Program's Facebook page ahead of the Zoom webinar. So do check in there for a more traditional introduction and bio for David Shields and upcoming guest writers. And thank you, Jason Daniels, for providing that earlier introduction. After the conversation, there will be a 20 to 30-minute Q&A. You will notice at the bottom of your screens that the Q&A function has been enabled. We encourage you to click there and type your questions in the latter half of the conversation and shortly after. Alan Borst will be selecting from the pool of questions and coordinating the Q&A. We also encourage you to purchase David Shields' books at your local bookstore. King's English Bookstore here in Salt Lake City currently has his most recent collection of essays, The Trouble with Men, Reflections on Sex, Love, Marriage, Porn, and Power on their shelves. Links to purchase books, as well as links for our webpage and social media are in the chat feed now, I believe. The Guest Writers Series was made possible through the University of Utah English Department and received funding from the Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks Program and Utah Humanities. Utah Humanities empowers groups and individuals to improve their communities through active engagement in the humanities. This series is also supported by the Utah Arts and Museums, with funding from the State of Utah and National Endowment for the Arts. Without further delay, David Shields and Paisley Rekdal.
Hello, hello. So delighted to get to speak to you, David.
Same with you, Paisley.
Yeah, and you're back in my own old hometown, Seattle. How's it going?
Know. Pretty well. Surviving as we all are.
Basically. I want to start with kind of a difficult question, but one that speaks to the moment. So you argued many years ago, right around Reality Hunger, which came out in 2010, you were talking a lot about how you had started out actually as a fiction writer, but you now pretty much only deal in nonfiction forms. We'll talk about some of those later. And one of the reasons you said was because the difference between fiction and nonfiction had really crumbled and maybe was just utterly dissolving. And that you said that in 2010, and I'm curious what you feel about that now, especially around this election, around this question of reality, unreality, fiction, nonfiction. Has that taken on a different weight for you?
No, I mean, that's a great place to start, Paisley. And, thanks for the challenging question. I mean, that's obviously it's a vexed issue. And I've seen, I'll try not to devote too much time to it, but it's an interesting one. That book, Reality Hunger, as you say, came out 10, 11 years ago. And what does it argue for? A blurring of boundaries between fiction and nonfiction, a rethinking of appropriation, and which is the subject of your forthcoming book, which I'm dying to read. And, trying to suggest sort of new art forms for the 21st century. So, how have things changed in the last 10 or so years, and to what degree do I maybe want to rethink those positions? I mean, trying to think of where to begin, other than to say, to me, it's almost the subject of a film that I've been working on by some colleagues that you know as well, Nicole Walker and Robin Hemley, and Nicole's husband, Eric Sather. And we are working on a film called How Do You Know What You Believe, where a couple of years ago, that we attended the Nonfiction Now conference in Phoenix. When was that? Just a couple days before the midterm elections in 2018. We asked a series of questions of nonfiction writers and professors, things like, is there such thing as absolute truth? How do you know if something's true? Do you have any absolute beliefs? Are you superstitious? Do you believe in ghosts? Have your siblings taught you that you're wrong? And why are you here and not canvassing for Stacey Abrams? And the idea of the film is to try to suggest, and that we're still a long ways away, and we're as lost as anyone, but the idea is over the last 150 years, I would argue from, say, Melville, Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, all the way through people like Jacques Derrida and contemporary writers of nonfiction, such as yourself and your students, there's been this huge movement, with the death of God and the death of absolute capital T truth and the whole variety of questioning of privileged positions, of subjective positions. So much of the energy of the last 100 years has been this idea that the perceiver by her very presence alters what's perceived. And then what we try to suggest in the film, and we're still a long way from figuring out, is that our understanding, in my understanding, is that these, to me, genuinely interesting sort of philosophical questions which have pervaded physics, philosophy, the sciences, the humanities, even definitely contemporary nonfiction, have been quite consciously weaponized as political theater by everyone from Putin's performance artist advisor to Steve Miller, Steve Bannon, Trump himself. And so, I think people want to say, to what degree does a book like, say, Reality Hunger provide odd grist for, a Trumpian malfeasance? And, I've thought about that, and I've worried about it, and I've questioned it. Not that that book, would have entered, Steve Bannon's precincts exactly, but is it part of the problem? Is a book like Reality Hunger, which argues for what? A kind of truth creep, like a questioning of nonfiction, a questioning, the kind of nonfiction I'm interested in uses the nonfiction frame to ask questions like what's true, what's knowledge, what's memory. And so is there a way in which that has gotten hijacked by as political carnival? I don't know. What do you,
well, I
jump in, Paisley.
Yeah, because I'm fascinated by this, because the question might be that because it's an appropriative text, weirdly, the question is not truth versus reality. The question is identity, which is actually a slightly different issue, which no one can debate and no one can dispute that those quotes had a factual basis. They come from other texts. They can be easily sourced. They can be easily discovered to have a root. And so, and have a meaning that may be apart from the text that you've created. So to a certain extent, it's not messing with truth or even factuality so much as authorship and authentic authorship. And that's slightly different. In that case, it might be more of a precursor, or considering it comes alongside of social media. Like social media certainly blurs that line between truth and fiction far more via the idea of the persona, and is this person real? Who's even created this?
I think that's a good distinction. I mean, this is slightly above my pay grade, but it's what scholars talk about, the sort of speech act. Like, what is the occasion of the speech act? And let's say Trump, the very first gunshot of Trump's administration was, and it seems so prescient now, the very first thing he did on the inauguration, of course, was to question, here's a photograph of his inauguration audience, which was a fraction the size of Obama's. And, you know, from the very beginning, what would that be? January 20th, 2017, you know, it was like, no, that is a false photograph. We have alternate facts. And so from the very beginning, the very argumentation of the next 3.5 years was set that we're going to dismantle or attempt to deconstruct what seemed to be an agreed upon reality. A photograph that shows 250,000 people is a photograph of a larger group than a group of 50,000 people. And to say that there is no distinction is really, you know, a new move in political theater. And so to me, that feels to me essentially different, you know, sort of intellectually different from a book like, say, mine, or a book like, say, Mary McCarthy's Memories of a Catholic Girlhood, which is questioning her own memories, or a book like yours, like a book like Intimate, you know, which is sort of worrying what your relationship is to a series of texts and photographs, in which I am acknowledging my own deeply flawed view of it. I'm sort of including my remix in part of the critique. That seems to me essentially different. You know, it has a different speech act that my role and the writers of nonfiction, whom I really admire, use a nonfiction frame to ask really interesting philosophical questions, but they include themselves in part of the critique as subjective human witnesses. That seems to me fundamentally different from a Trumpian attempt to hijack reality. That just feels, and you know, I'd be happy to hear pushback on that, but you know, it's a challenging thing, which I certainly worry about.
Well, I think I basically agree with you, because to a certain extent, the worldview is, I mean, it is so different. The desire, weirdly, in the inauthentic, in the nonfiction realm, is to get closer to a sense of a kind of truth, whether
Right.
it's personal truth or social truth, right? A way of a better cultural critique that might be more true than a previous one. Whereas the other side would be arguing, we just don't want any truth that gets in the way of our political agenda. And that's a completely different project, as you're pointing out. But it leads to my other question, which is, as you're pointing out, nonfiction relies so heavily on the self, the presence of the self, the revelation of the self, and the participation of the self in that revelation. And I'm curious about how you approach creating a character of the self. I mean, what does that mean? Because it's never you, right? Like, it's the thing, when we're writing about ourselves, we still aren't writing about ourselves. So I'm curious if you could talk about your process and thinking about yourself as character, what that looks like, how you construct for it, and how you teach the self as a character.
Right. Well, that's huge stuff too, you know, and I'm sure where to start with that, Paisley. I think of, I don't know if you or your students know the documentary filmmaker Ross McElwee. I love McElwee's work, like a film like Sherman's March.
That's right, Sherman's March, yes.
That he has had a huge influence on me in terms of that I was a fiction writer for the first 10 or 15, just trying to get the lighting right here, make sure that I'm ready for my close-up here. Just seems like a little.
It looks like you're turning into the wall slightly.
I know, I feel like I should. I know, let me fix the lighting here a little bit. Sorry. Yeah. But don't know if that's too dark. Let's see, how are we doing? That's probably as worse, isn't it? Sorry.
No, there's some shading.
But anyway, I'll try and get this right. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
I'm some kind of incipient filmmaker. You think I could get the lighting?
I was going to say that the really amusing thing is that you work in documentary films, which I'm going to be asking.
I know, my God. Luckily, I have technical people to help me. I think that is better now, isn't it?
You look great.
So what was I going to say? Yeah, the self and McElwee. It's funny because they were just talking about documentary films, and that Ross, you know, I wrote 3 novels in my in my 20s and early 30s, and I started to watch a whole series of reflexive documentary films, which are now sort of called cine essay, sort of the essay as film. And I was so mesmerized by them, so catalyzed, so inspired, that I felt like they were doing so much. And it's not as if a series of nonfiction writers and stand-up comedians and performance artists and anthropological autobiographers weren't also doing the same things. They all inspired me, but I was really riveted by McAway's doc films, in which he sort of uses himself as a divining rod into his larger material. And something that Ross says is really great and useful here, perhaps. He says, you know, someone asked him, what makes for a good figure or person or character in a documentary film? And he said, the person has to know who they are, be comfortable with their personality and character flaws, and be willing to extend that personality for dramatic effect. I just think that's so helpful. That, you know, it's not that you're, again, we're back to your first question in a way, Paisley, which is, you know, it's not like you're lying. It's not as if you're pretending you're a bank robber when you're not, but you are willing to extend the impulses of your personality for dramatic and thematic effect. And, you know, I think that's largely what I do. You know, I tend to have some kind of autobiographical presence in my books, not always, but often. But in that book, I tend to phrase myself, I think, as more obsessed with the question than I really am. And I think I feel like I place myself in harm's way for rather sort of thematic purposes. I'm trying to think of a good example. Well, let's say a book of mine, like say, the thing about life is that the one day you'll be dead, a meditation on mortality from 12 years ago. At the time, you know, I'm now 64. You know, at the time I wrote the book, I was in my early to mid 50s, and you know, I had an elderly father who was strangely vital. He was winning tennis matches at age 90, and I had a young daughter who was this sort of wonderful soccer player, and I was sort of had all kinds of relatively minor physical ailments, but I had a bad back that was really hurting me, and I could hardly walk. It was bad for a couple of years. So, but anyway, in the book, I sort of phrased myself as barely able to take a breath without obsessing on my imminent mortality. And, you know, like there was a part in which I sort of entered this weird sort of middle-aged menopause and felt like weirdly old at age 48. But I felt it. I don't know if that's I don't know how, you probably are much younger than that. But you know, I sort of took the core of my mortal, you know, we're all are mortal. I'm a completely secular person, and I think I'm probably slightly more obsessed with the mortal fact than perhaps most people are. But in the book, I phrased and framed myself as this sort of existential maniac who's obsessed with the fact that his father is vital and his daughter is vital, and he is sort of awash in mortal contemplation. So that strikes me as essentially what I do in virtually every book I've written of nonfiction, from Remote in 1996, in which I pretend to be more obsessed with American mass media than I probably am, all the way through my most recent book, The Trouble with Men, in which I probably take some of my more dire emotional states and blow them up for dramatic effect. I don't know if that rings true for you,
it
Paisley.
does. Yeah, I was thinking, going along with the question of risk. Well, two things strike me. I'll get to the second thing in a minute. But when you were first talking, I just thought that was a really interesting parallel that nonfiction actually has with comedy, because a lot of the ways you describe, you know, your process of making yourself a character, taking something that is essentially there and bowdlerizing it, is the focus. I mean, it's like the spine of so many Woody Allen movies, actually, which is that, is he actually that neurotic? Is he actually, but the line between comedy and nonfiction actually is much closer than I had imagined before. But I think it's
Totally. I'm obsessed. I'm obsessed with that. But I didn't mean to interrupt. But I think stand up is this amazing model for me as a kid. Growing up in California, I had a horrible stutter. I could hardly talk. I was obsessed with stand-up comedians. I would listen to them on San Francisco radio, or that my dad would take me to sort of, comedians working blue when I was, age 12 or whatever. We go see Red Fox or whoever at various San Francisco nightclubs. And the whole idea of this sculpted persona of whether it's Chris Rock or Richard Pryor or Sandra Bernard, Spalding Gray, Eric Bogosian, Rick Reynolds. I was and am enormously influenced by that thing stand-up comedians do. Tell autobiographical tales, but carve a clearly sculpted persona. And then the key thing for me is to wed that sculpted persona to a thematic investigation, so that in the sculpting of your persona, you're exaggerating certain qualities in order to illuminate kind of a larger question that your book's exploring. That really is incredibly stand-up. I think that's exactly right.
And it also becomes archetypal. That's another thing that comedians also do with nonfiction, which is it's in that Baudelarization, it's in that linking to the larger, that you end up creating a sort of archetypal character, even out of something that's very quirky and individual.
I think that's a great point. And it's something that, as a poet, is that, going back millennia, nobody worries how true the first person voice is, of Sappho or Catullus or Emily Dickinson or Whitman or Plath or whoever. That we understand it's a very clear poet, but here she is, a lyric speaker. And in that speech act, here she is telling existential truths. And whether, Sylvia Plath was really wearing a purple scarf or an orange scarf that particular day is of no particular moment, a physical autobiography. And I think it's one of the lovely passages in reality is to make exactly this claim that I would like, I've been part of a movement, as have you, to try to view the lyric impulse in book-length essay as very much in league with the way that we view the speech of, say, a lyric poet. That I want to reclaim for the essay form, a genuine artistic tradition, and not see it as some subset of journalism that has to be vetted for fact, but as a subset of metaphysical contemplation that has to be judged for its sort of human depth. So that's really the core of my writing life.
I want to get to the second point that I had almost forgotten, but going back to something you said earlier about risk. There's been many times when I've been reading your work where I thought, that's a risky move. And it gets riskier every year that more and more of ourselves are on social media. And so one of your last books, which is also a movie, You're Totally Wrong, or I can't remember the title.
I think You're Totally Wrong.
I think You're Totally Wrong. And where you're in the cabin. And I think what's risky about it is that you go into certain corners of masculinity, which as a woman I'm fascinated by. And then when I come up against them, I'm actually horrified by as well.
Right.
And I'm really curious about that sense of risk when you're writing about masculinity, gender, relationships. When you write, for instance, essays where you're mining an ex-girlfriend's diary or her letters or something like that, it enters into this very risky territory. So I'm just curious how you were thinking about that. When you revisit your work, do you think, man, I couldn't have done that now, or I wouldn't choose to do that now?
I think those are all interesting questions. I mean, I wonder what the passage was, Paisley, and I think you're totally wrong. Do you recall, or just a general atmosphere of masculinity?
Well, the ones that got me, and I have to say it was both, I mean, I had all of the emotions reading it, but it was the passages where you were in the cabin and there was, I think Caleb was the name of the writer, where he, he didn't fulfill his artistic ambitions and he was basically a house husband. And there's a way in which your character needles him about basically not measuring up to all of his promise, not his promise as a writer and not his promise basically as a man coming up in society. And there's these moments, and what's amazing about the passage is it's knowing at the same time. There's something so id-like about your character kind of going down that path. It's a thing that it's expressing the thing that no one is allowed to say. So right. when you're writing that, did you find, especially since you made it into a film as well, do you find that extension of the character's self, the Baudelarizing or the broadening of that self in any way? Do you find yourself acting on the page and acting in front of the camera in that way? Like you would never say this in any other context, right?
I know what you mean. I think the whole question of acting is a troublesome one.
Right.
And I don't know if you ever looked at the film, but I think Caleb is always, it's available if anyone wants to see it, where a former student, directed it, and Caleb and I play ourselves, and it's a very unusual, very odd little thing, but Caleb is always accusing me of acting for the camera, of saying things for dramatic effect.
Wow.
And I think it's an interesting question. Are there ways in which there are things I've said, in The Trouble with Men or my book on Trump, in which I'm saying stuff at some point, am I sometimes saying things because I know it'll get a rise out of myself, less the reader than myself? It's almost like if I can bring it to consciousness and I've said it, do I absolutely 100% believe it? All I know is that those words came to my mouth or my, computer screen, and I found myself writing it. I'm trying to think of where to go with this so that it's interesting and not apologetic or defensive. I mean, I think surely there are things I've written. I had a fascinating experience where I gave a reading of, I think the essay you mentioned, where I'm in college and I think I'm not sexually experienced and I feel insecure, and so I read surreptitiously my would-be girlfriend's journal, and it's a very odd and somewhat sort of violating thing I do. And I must have written that essay, my goodness, the essay aloud at a university a few years ago, shortly after Trump's election. It really landed wrong to the audience in a way that was really instructive to me. And I felt like in that moment, I really felt the culture shift. It's like I actually got it as a man. Like I got it. Like there was so much anger in the room, as well there should be, because I think Trump had just been elected. And there was sort of a free-floating animus toward all male violations and a private one, but there was, in a way, no forgiveness for any kind of male transgression. And it was a really interesting moment. And I realized, in a way, that essay couldn't be written now or shouldn't be written now, or it would be very hard to read it aloud again. And before it played out as sort of, I don't know what, tragic comedy or something, but the culture had changed. And it took me a while to realize how problematic that essay is and was. And certainly there's things, I mean, even my doc film, Lynch, A History, which came out a year and a half ago, is an interesting example where I'm 30 years older than Marshawn Lynch. I'm white, I'm a professor, and I have made a documentary film about a Black athlete and his use of silence as a form of cultural protest. And I think the film, it's, streaming on Sundance Channel now and stuff like that. It's gotten a nice audience, but I do think a lot, Marshawn Lynch said that he would not participate in the film, but he wouldn't stop it either. And he actually told me privately that he liked the film. But because he didn't directly participate in the film and did not care to be interviewed for any articles about the film, I think there's a way in which I would not or couldn't make that film now. That I made the film in, say, 2014 to 2018, came out in 2019. But I would say the conversation has shifted even more so since then, which in a way I would think is partly the subject of your forthcoming book, which is, again, is my plea to have you scoot a galley my way because I'm dying to read it. It's coming out quite soon, isn't it? In February?
Yeah. I keep forgetting about it, but yes.
It sounds amazing. And they're very troublesome and vexing questions. I want to remain a risk-taking artist. I want never to bore myself or bore the reader. I'm hugely invested in the idea of the drama of nonfiction consisting entirely of saying and exploring what you're not supposed to say and explore. I'm never going to become, I hope, a programmatic or formulaic writer who only speaks conventional wisdom. All the excitement for me of the essay form is precisely the increasingly harrowing things that the speaker says about himself and the human animal. Like, that's its excitement to me. But, one sees how one has written something that one would no longer write now, or that one could no longer read, or, the idea of boredom is the main thing for me. Is, I don't want to ever bore myself or bore the reader. So even though I find some of these questions vexing, I'm just so invested, alas, in the question of art as troublemaking. Is really like the Picasso line, all acts of creation begin with an act of destruction. It's rather melodramatic and maybe a little old-fashioned modernism, but I really believe in that, and I believe in taking these risks. And as the V.S. Naipaul thing, if you want to write seriously, you have to be willing to break the forms. And I guess I'd also say you also have to be willing to break the conventional wisdoms as well.
Yeah. I mean, I'm asking this. I mean, I think every writer with any kind of career has exactly this experience that you've had, which is that there's the shifting ideas of what becomes an appropriate revelation or an appropriate form of self-revelation. And that's the funny thing, as you're talking about it, it really struck me that, I mean, if we think about the thing that makes fiction what it is that fiction is creation. And nonfiction, I think, is that act of self-revelation. And if fiction has genres and fashionable modes that go in and out, self-revelation has fashionable modes that go in and out as well. And we forget that until we're in it. But all of us eventually kind of fall in and out at the same time.
I know what you mean. That rings terribly true. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, I can look back at work of mine and go, that might have been different.
Right.
But I want to. Because now people are entering my house. I want to end with one question, and then we'll take questions from other people. But, speaking of this way of dissolving genres, changing them, you have done so much remixing and working within collage forms, and then documentary sort of films, cinefilms, things like their cine essays. And so I'm kind of curious if you just say one last thing. What do you like about collage? In particular, what do you like about appropriation and collage?
Let's see where to start with that, Paisley. I think that, I guess I can't help but think of how I wound up with it. That as I said at the beginning, I wrote, or perhaps I said, I forget, but I wrote 3 novels in my 20s and early 30s, trying to write my 4th novel. Then under the influence of a galaxy of other forms, stand-up, sort of early versions of autofiction, self-reflexive doc film, performance art, all kinds of stuff, I found that for some reason the fictional gesture had gone oddly flat and cold for me. And in a way, the last 25 years have been a series of experiments for me, trying to get around basically a massive writing block. I couldn't write my 4th novel, and so I've contrived all these strategies around it. It still baffles me that I had written these 3 novels that were okay. I really hadn't found my métier, and then my aborted 4th novel became my first book of nonfiction, this book called Remote, Reflections on Life in the Shadow of Celebrity, sort of these 52 fragmented riffs on mass culture. And I guess like ever since then, I've been working almost exclusively as a writer, a reader, an anthologist, a teacher of collage. It's almost my, I have trouble reading stuff that doesn't have a lot of white space. And what is it I'm so drawn toward? I guess for me, it's just it places the emphasis on where it should. That is to say, I think of this line of David Foster Wallace. So someone asked him, what's so great about literature? And he said, they were existentially alone on the planet. You can't know what I'm thinking and feeling, and I can't know what you're thinking and feeling. But literature at its best is a bridge that we build across the abyss of human loneliness. And what I found in the very, very best collages, and most collages are bad, just like most novels are bad, and most memoirs are bad, and most doctors are bad. Most stuff is bad. But the occasional amazing work of literary collage, it seems to me it really builds about as sturdy a bridge across the abyss of human loneliness. Because what happens, it seems to me, in the very most powerful collages for me is that the writer teaches the reader nothing less than how he or she thinks. You actually feel like you're inside the consciousness of that particular speaker. And let's say I'm thinking of Annie Ernaux's Things Seen, a book I just absolutely love. After a while, you get even the most subtle juxtapositions. You go, I get what you're doing. You don't have to explain it to me. You're taking me inside of your human consciousness. And that I just find collage at its best assuages human loneliness in a way that very few other things do. And then I think the flip side of that for me is that it gets rid of all the boring stuff. I mean, so much, and again, these are slightly fighting words, I guess, but in a lot of conventional novels, a lot of conventional memoirs, there's so much throat clearing and finger painting and furniture moving and table setting. It's like, get to the freaking point, please. There's so much conventional gesturing. There's so much, okay, here comes the moment where, we get the 1.5-page description of the mother-in-law's house in Racine, Wisconsin. It's like, why? Why do we need that? Because that has been the way people have written those books for 300 years. So part of it is, I think, too, collage feels very, very contemporary in its sort of channel changing, mode switching, social media-ish, I'll go anywhere I want, anytime I want, so long as I'm getting a deeper and deeper purchase on the material that I'm exploring. I mean, does that ring true? I think of you as a collagist in many ways. I mean,
that's just because when I write, people get stuck in dinners and they can't get out of rooms. They die at dinner tables because they just can't seem to ever exit. So for me, it's a narrative I see myself collaging because it's a narrative weakness, not necessarily narrative strength.
Totally, totally.
Oh, really? Okay, that's good. Well, I'm gonna stop yapping at you and get questions from the audience. I'm sure there's tons right now, but that was a beautiful way to stop our conversation around the idea of like getting to the heart faster and multiple bridges across loneliness. Yeah. So here's the first one. It's one of my students. Yay. So I listened to an interview you did with Scott Jones for Give and Take a couple of years ago. And you mentioned there that you winnowed down the material for The Trouble with Men from 300 full notebooks. My God. I wonder if you would talk a little bit about your selection process and how you construct books from such a broad volume of material. That's a great question. 300 books.
Well, I don't know what I mean, Scott Kent Jones has an amazing podcast called Give and Take, and Scott and I have become really good friends, and he just texted me a few minutes ago, actually. So, I mean, he's great. I really recommend Scott's podcast called Give and Take. So that's what your student happened to be listening to. He's a very, very thoughtful podcaster, but I guess I was talking about this book, The Trouble with Men, came out in 2019, and I don't know about 300 notebooks. I think that what I said, this is probably a slight exaggeration, but it is, I mean, that book is a very brief book, 135 pages with a lot of white space, a lot of quotes from other people. It's probably only around perhaps 30,000 words, if that. But believe it or not, it really began as, it was once literally 3,000 pages long of just draft of material, just stuff, notes from myself, long articles I read, you know, research I'd done, old stuff I'd written. And it was just, you know, it was maybe perhaps 30 notebooks of 100 pages long of stuff that I had gathered over really 10 or 12 years. I think that's typically the way I work on a book. That, I mean, I basically have at this point almost a methodology as a collage writer that goes something like this, where I come up with a big idea, or at least what passes for a big idea to me, some big subject which I really care about, some huge thing like reality or death or sex or celebrity. Some huge subject which, you know, is not exhaustible, but that I feel some vexation toward, some contradiction toward. I've always liked that Auden line, great art is clear thinking about mixed feelings. And that I have some subject that I'm honestly, passionately confused about. Like, say, Trump. I did a book on Trump. I mean, I'm not confused about him politically, but I was fascinated. I'm no longer fascinated, but at the time I was fascinated by his odd performance skills and why I found them oddly mesmerizing. I wanted to explore what could his hold be on the public imagination, even as I was working to defeat him politically. I was at the time sort of fascinated and embarrassed by my kind of fascination with Trump's performance abilities, almost like a stand-up comic in many ways. But so I start with a big subject about which I care and about which I'm confused. And then I do what I call shoot a lot of film. You know, if it's a book, it's not literally shooting film. If it's a film, I actually shoot film, but I just sort of gather stuff for as long as I possibly can, take a lot of notes. I do some reportage where I try and get out of my house and, you know, talk to people, investigate it, you know, read things, you know, sometimes and have research assistants help me, like on the Trump thing. I had some research assistants literally watch every episode of The Apprentice, you know, and just pull interesting quotes, you know, like I wasn't going to do that, but perhaps someone else will. But so anyway, at that point, I have an idea. I shoot a lot of film. I just keep on gathering stuff. And I sort of know when the gathering process is over, when I am bored. That is to say, I'm not learning anything new. Everything that comes in is a confirmation of what I've already thought. And that's very visceral. And so at that point, I typically have maybe 1,000 pages or several hundred at the very least. And then becomes a rather nervous making procedure in which I have to, I print out all the pages, as I say, probably several hundred or 1,000 pages. And I try and really that is when the winnowing occurs, where through a very, very harsh eye, I try and look and see if there's anything there that feels really alive to me, that really feels uncliched, that makes me nervous, really, to go back to Paisley's earlier question, that feels surprising or startling or embarrassing or somehow feels alive. It always feels like you're, panning for gold, that in these 1,000 pages that you might have, let's say, one hopes, sort of 300 or 400 really alive paragraphs. And then you kind of, I get rid of 90% of it, even 95% of it. And then I sort of literally color code the different paragraphs according to their thematic tilt. So I tend to, let's say, I don't know, whatever the thing is, like in The Trouble with Men, there's a whole chapter about, say, childhood. So all the stuff on childhood, I might color code orange, and all the stuff on marriage, I might color code purple or whatever. So I sort of have these thematic silos, and then I try and organize every thematic silo for maximum momentum. And then I try and put the silos or chapters into the most effective order. So I hope that is the chapters by themes, or do I sort of run it as a crazy quilt collage, like say, I don't know, let's say how, say, Maggie Nelson does it in Bluets, like 240 paragraphs in seemingly random, but actually musically arranged order, or do I put them in sort of codified chapters, as, say, Renata Adler does in a book like Speedboat? And I think that both can work, and I've done it both ways. So, I shoot a lot of film. I look for stuff that's good. I put like with like, and, often find the book. Like, I didn't realize what Trouble with Men was about until many, many years deeply into the book. So I'm happy to talk some more about that, but is my general process.
I'm going to ask, we have a couple more questions, we have a lot more questions, but I'm going to jump to two more. So here's one. Thank you for this interesting conversation. What if art that challenges is also offensive to others? I ask this question with sincerity and seriousness.
Yeah, I mean, that's the price of the ticket. I mean, there you go. There's where it gets interesting. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I don't have the easy answer. Like, for instance, I'm trying to think of how to answer it other than what does one do? Like, for instance, I can't help but think of this moment. Like, I showed this doc film called Lynch a History, which is this sort of love song to Marshawn Lynch's use of silence as a form of protest. But there are a couple passages in the film where I use Bill Cosby and Louis C.K. and a third person who has been sort of sidelined by the cultural conversation, for, probably good reasons, especially Cosby, obviously. So here are these sort of, properly reviled figures, especially Cosby. And I went back and forth on whether I should include Cosby as a relatively young man saying pretty interesting things about Black people and white filmmakers and who owns who's gays. And it was startling to see him talking about this stuff in a pretty interesting and provocative way. And now, of course, when one sees Cosby, one only thinks of one thing, as one should. But I was, and I may have made the wrong call on that, but I think there's a third person. I can't recall the third sort of canceled person that we included in the film. but it was quite a conscious strategy on my part to throw the viewer off stride and to say, oh my God, there's a young Bill Cosby saying something pretty damn interesting. And that in a way, so much of the film is about how Marshawn Lynch had been perceived in this rather cartoonish way as, you know, a thug or a gangster. And I was trying to suggest what an unbelievably intentional and purposeful and deeply political and brilliant person that Marshawn Lynch is. And in a way, I was trying to suggest that the cartoon of Marshawn Lynch was horribly wrong. And in a way, I was trying to argue for the three-dimensionality of all human beings. I mean, it doesn't in any way mitigate what, say, Bill Cosby or Louis C.K. did, but it also suggests that they have said things that were smart and funny and insightful. And so that would be an example where I could have, I mean, it wasn't a very brave call or anything, but I said it was more important to me to, you know, throw that in there as an interesting challenge to the viewer rather than take the slightly easier path of, okay, let's get rid of, let's say, Cosby. I sort of liked the way it insisted on his three-dimensionality. And I guess I really struggled with it, though, and I think that's all that one can ask. I wasn't being oblivious, like, oh, so what if I have Cosby and I don't care if it discomforts the viewer. It was quite a conscious choice. And I think that seems like a fair thing to ask the writer. You might offend someone. And also, I want to be prepared to learn from someone being offended, like the time I read that essay at a university virtually days after Trump's election. And I was really mortified by how the essay landed. And I realized the culture had changed and that essay was no longer welcome at this time. So I think what does one want? A certain consciousness brought to those decisions, but I also don't want to ever be, I hope, take the easy way out of always trying to phone in only art that meets a lowest common denominator of moral certitude. That I'm quite sure that doesn't interest me.
I'm going to move because we only have a few minutes left. So one last question. And this is a fascinating one. So in your essay, The Only Solution to the Soul is the Senses, you write about how Bill Murray's mode of delivery and acting is to add invisible, ironic quotes around nearly every word he says, of how this kind of detachment is a way to get to real feeling. And you suggest that he succeeds. So how closely do you feel your own mode of writing, i.e. The Trouble with Men, hews to your description of Murray's mode of acting? And how far do you think your own writing succeeds in getting to real feeling? That was in quotes, not me adding the quotes. Mm-hmm. The quotes in.
That's such a great question.
Isn't that a great question? Yeah, and I'm really
so. I mean, that's the core of my Murray essay, and it's such a smart move to bring it back to my own stuff. I mean, that's, I think, the reason that I don't think that Murray interests me very much anymore. It seems very male in a way that I'm not as invested in. It seems sort of boyish to me and sort of silly, but you know, I was fascinated by Murray and my sort of love-hate relationship to his antics. And but the question is such a great one, like how, I guess for me, it's, you know, it's sort of what is the move that Murray makes? You know, he empties out feeling, and in emptying out feeling, he tries to get to some deeper feeling. There was a book of poems, wish I could find it right now, that Louise Gluck chose for like the best Yale series of younger poets awards several years ago. And you may know the poet who used to live in, I thought she might have lived in Salt Lake, but anyway, she published a book of poems, and Louise Gluck's praise of it was precisely that she admired this young poet's sort of puncturing of inauthentic feeling, that she was trying to get to real feeling. She was trying to question, all those Christmassy and things, all those easy feelings that pass for feeling in commercial, let's say, American culture. And that on some level you could think, oh, she's just an ironist or whatever. But in Gluck's formulation, the writer was trying to get to actual feeling. And maybe it's an overquoted passage, that passage of Ben Lerner's in Leaving the Etosha Station, where he says, the only thing that I knew, the thing I was moved by was by being in a Madrid art gallery. And I was moved by my own incapacity to be moved, which might seem, I don't know what, postmodern or very male or very white or very upper middle class or privileged or something. But I do like that passage. I do think it's the passage, it is to a large degree, I think, especially now, 2020, social media, Trumpian insanity, I think it's very hard to feel stuff in, I think, 2020, because for a variety of probably obvious reasons. And I think I think the questioner has a good question. Am I just doing quotes upon quotes upon quotes? Is there any authentic feeling in my work? I hope so. I mean, that's not up to me to judge, but to me, the whole project and program, the writers I tend to love the most, in emptying out and deconstructing false received feeling, are trying to get to what it's really, really like on their own nerve endings now. Those feelings might be difficult, they might be self-conscious, they might be tortured, they might be wrapped in huge amount of self-consciousness, but it's what it feels like to be alive now, and I think so much of writing, which I find wanting, is phoning in feelings from previous decades and previous centuries and pretend that we feel about, let's say, love or romance the way Jane Austen felt. I know that we don't feel that way. And we feel differently. And it's really, I think the challenge of contemporary writing is to show sort of what it feels like now in these really complicated ways, and Murray and a whole series of other writers, and these go back, many of them centuries, trying to get to a kind of, let's call it a kind of deconstructed feeling state. That might bore a lot of people, but I think people who are demanding a really rigorous art, it feels really thrilling.
That's a great place to stop. Alan's going to come back on, but I just want to remind everyone that you can buy books by David Shields from the King's English Bookstore. It is in our chat, so you can go right now and start doing that. Alan?
Yeah, on behalf of the University of Utah Creative Writing Program and all of us in attendance, I want to offer a very hearty thank you to you, David, and also our own Paisley. Rekdal. This has been terrific and engaging. Really glad we were able to make this happen. For those of you out there watching, our next virtual guest writer series event features Diana Coy Wynn and Meme Bersenbrugge. That's going to be in roughly 2 weeks on Wednesday, October 21st. And our registration information and all that will be up on our webpage in the days to come. If you want to watch this all over again or share it with your friends, we'll also have the video recording of this evening's conversation available for you in a couple days' time. So thank you again, David. Thank you so much, Paisley.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paisley.
That was amazing.
That was so great. Really great to chat.
All right.
Terrific. Well, thanks again. It's a wrap. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.